I'm going to go back 5 years ago when Warren was sitting here giving a paper on the self, and exchange began between us about the self, and seems to be continuing, or I hope that it's continuing this evening. And as part of that exchange, he wrote me a very good letter, and I'm going to quote from it. Trying to think about the self, this is in regard to his own study, was like trying to grasp a jelly that keeps slipping out of your hand. Someone pointed out to me that Mercury would be an apt image of this, and I suddenly understood why Mercurius holds such a central position in Jung's thinking. Recently, in response, and anticipating this evening, I passed on to him the definition of self that I discovered in the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy. The entire entry, apart from cross-references, states, self, the elusive I that shows an alarming tendency to disappear when we try to introspect it. Now, in the time I've been working on this study, I too have had this slipperiness to the self, and I came across a principle in philosophy, epistemology actually, that's an extension of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You'll understand what I mean when we get beyond it, so don't get bogged down in, oh Lord, quantum physics. Now, the principle pertains when a particular relationship exists between a pair of properties, such as the momentum and the position of the particle. And the principle, which is called the principle of complementarity, reads that when this relationship holds, the more determinant or sharp the value of one of the quantities, and the less determinant or more unsharp its value for the other quantity. Now, in regard to this study, the pair of conjugates, as they're known, are that the self is both the subject studying as well as the object studied. And Heisenberg was aware of this.
No, that's my... Oh, no. No, that's my...
In Michael Frayn's play Copenhagen, the character Heisenberg refers to this application of complementarity. This is Heisenberg de Boer. Exactly where you go as you ramble around is, of course, completely determined by your genes and the various physical principles acting upon you. But it's also completely determined by your own entirely inscrutable whims from one moment to the next. So we can't completely understand your behavior without seeing it both ways at once, and that's impossible. Which means that your extraordinary peregrinations are not fully objective aspects of the universe. They exist only partially, as our minds shift endlessly back and forth between the two approaches. Now, I think Fordham appreciated this. I don't think that he thought of it in these terms, but the way he phrased it was, the concept of totality is particularly difficult to construct. Indeed, it is impossible. So, with that forewarning, I guess, we'll go on. This study that I'm presenting this evening is part of a longer one and includes the development of Fordham's model. And I think it would be very difficult to listen to. It's not as well written as yet as I hope that it would become. But just to say that it did not emerge like Venus, full-blown. It took about 20 years to reach the point when it appears as a way I recognize it. It started in 1947 when he is discovering the processes of what will become deintegration and reintegration in work with small children. And he's looking at ego development. And then it goes through a lot of, peregrinations before it reaches a point in 1969 where the first book he wrote becomes retitled From the Life of Childhood to Children as Individuals, which captures the essence of the peregrinations that he's making. My starting point is really what I feel is the culmination in his work on the self, in his 1985 book, Explorations into the Self. How many have read Explorations into the Self? Brave. How many could get through it pretty much at one sitting? I don't know about others. I find it extraordinarily difficult. Maybe it's important to keep in mind that he had been ill, and I don't know that he was fully recovered. I think that he was still tired at the time. By that time, his wife had become quite frail and dependent, and he had said that she had contributed to making his writing readable. And this book is highly condensed. And even as it stands in the condensed form, the editing work is unfortunately not of the standard that he set by the quality of his work. But I think it's a very impressive piece of work, and shows his mind operating really at its best. So I'm going to start with how I understand his model as it's reached this point of culmination. And to begin with, when I talk about the model, I can't help but put in my interpretations. I'm trying to make clarifications, but to begin with, when I talk about the model, I'm trying to describe what I think his thinking is. In the second part, I will try to distinguish areas that have come to me where he and Jung differ. Now, I think that Fordham uses the term primary self in two ways. Primary self was his original postulate, which I assume everybody knows. Explicitly stated, it's a postulate with which he associates certain subjective states of integration. Implicit in what Fordham is saying is that it also refers to a period of development. Now, this is implied because the primary self and its actions or processes cannot be separated except conceptually, any more than structures can be separated from processes at any point in the life of the organism. Now, as a postulate, the primary self is a psychosomatic integrate that is empty in the sense that it is without phenomena, so that it is nothing but potential. Rosemary Gordon has described the primary self as, quote, a matrix of all those potential faculties of the organism which make the process of deintegration and reintegration in order to become operative and therefore actualize themselves. Mario Jacobi associates the primary self with potential, commenting that, quote, I would agree with the notion of the self as the original potential. Elsewhere, I've commented the primary self might be seen as analogous to the egg at the instant, if there is one, of fertilization, which is actually a moment conceptually held in time. And Astor describes it as somewhat analogous to the potential in DNA, but probably without its hereditary constituents. Unlike the egg at the moment of fertilization, but like the cosmic egg to which Fordham had previously associated it in 1957, the primary self is a mystical concept, referring to the nothing that is everything. Although the primary self has no representations, there are subjective states experienced in early infancy, such as those that Fordham conceptualized as following a satisfying feed, as well as later on, including those which refer to a kind of pregnant absence, or the way Bien describes O, that expresses the potential that is the hallmark of the primary self. Now, the concept implies that the infant is an individual from the start, and that development begins from within, given, of course, an adequate environmental background. A physiological parallel is the onset of the embryo's heartbeat. As the embryo's first observable activity at about 3 weeks, the heartbeat initially originates within the heart itself, It is not a response to an external stimulus. Like the heartbeat, the primary self originates from within the individual. Inherent in the concept of the primary self is its dynamic, the complementary processes of deintegration and reintegration that together Fordham terms actions of the self. This dynamic is easily recognized in a hypothesis reached by Thalen from her studies on early infant motor development. And she writes, "In order to understand development, we have to understand that complex systems are self-organizing. They prefer certain states of equilibrium. However, they can be pushed towards new states of equilibrium by particular forces, acting from within the organism or from the external environment. Thus, development is understood as a progression through a series of stable states, deintegration and reintegration. As the earliest period in development, the primary self is assumed to operate from before birth. It's an assumption substantiated by, amongst others, by Piantelli's observations of fetal development. Her studies show fetuses exploring their intrauterine home, playing with the placenta, touching themselves, their mouths, their faces, their toes, and in twinships, their fetal sibling through the membranes that separate them. Fordham conceptualized deintegration and reintegration in order to account for developmental processes that occur before structures and contents become established. He held that initially actions of the self in relation to the mother produce states of primitive identity, and that he concluded his work thinking that states of primitive identity came before projective or interjective identification. I don't want to get too bogged down in the detail of this, but neurological science is discovering the split-second timing of right brain function in early infancy. And Jean probably knows more about this than I do. What is impressive is that for all of us, and as in infancy, it takes 30 milliseconds to appraise facially emotional cues, 100 milliseconds to detect and carry out complex processing of change within a face, and 300 to 400 milliseconds, less than half a second, to mirror and synchronously match an emotionally expressive face. Now, this matching is a bodily response, whereby there's a pretty much split-second automatic chemical, well, it's the emotions of chemistry that is a visceral response that is a part of the emotion. That an emotion is, I'll get to later, is a physiological response. And that both parties, both mother and baby, this is happening to, so between them, they co-construct these experiences which are shared experiences, states of fusion. Deintegration produces deintegrates, which are early protostructures and contents. Deintegration and deintegrates are conceived as processes, structures, and experiences that are part of the self in a way that makes them analogous to the relationship of the pseudopodia to the amoeba. Early deintegrates are structured via reintegration, which shapes them along archetypal lines. In time, these protostructures, which are made up of fragments of similar kinds of experience, such as good, bad, I, and not I, coalesce into more stable structures that develop into archetypal forms and the ego. As they all began as deintegrates, they maintain a fundamental link with the primary self. The neurological understanding behind this is that experiences provoke firings in the brain that over time become wired together, and these wirings, if repeated often enough, become pattern, that is, integrated responses. Over time, a more coherent sense of self begins to emerge, indicating that the ego has taken on some preliminary form, and that representations of the self are becoming established in the ego. Fordham's position contrasts with developmental theorists who hold the baby's self-representations are derived fundamentally from internalizing experiences of and with the mother. In Fordham's model of the sense of self derives from the primary self through deintegration and reintegration, not exclusively. And that means that the infant as well as the mother contribute to the making of their relationship, and hence to the infant's sense of self. I think an example of this is that some babies make good use over what's available to them. And some babies who have a very rich maternal environment, for some reason can't make use of it. So there is something in the baby that goes into the relationship and creates the relationship as well as a sense of self. It took me quite a while to work out this business about self-representations in Fordham's model, and I think that I understand it a bit better now. An example of this is in the mother-baby unit where I work. I have a mother-baby group, and on one occasion there were two babies. There was one who was 5 months and one who was 8 months. They were physically about the same size, but developmentally they weren't the same. And there was a large doll about the size of the babies, and that both were attracted to this doll. So I was with mothers and other babies. We put the doll next to them to see what would happen. And they both sort of played with it and inspected it, and then the doll began to sort of topple back and forth so that it fell from one to the other. And when the younger one had it, the older one would grab it and pull it away. And this happened several times. The younger one never took it away from the older one, and when the older one took it away from the younger one just kind of looked rather baffled as to why this was going away from it. The older one seemed to have a sense of, I want that. I can get that. I want that to be mine. What seemed to be a more coherent sense of himself than the younger one. And I think that that's what Fordham meant by self-representations becoming part of the ego. I don't know how conscious you can call this within the baby, but this expression of, I want, I can get. Fordham links the infant's developing sense of himself with individuation. Excuse me. He holds that the infant is an individual from the start, so that individuation, that is, the basic individuality, becomes the realization of his condition through the development of self-representations. This is another way of saying that the infant's ego is developing a gradually more discriminated sense of his individuality out of a psychosomatic unity that is beyond his experience, let alone his consciousness. In this process, experiences involving various senses of himself are incorporated around a sense of having a center, a state that Fordham relates back to the original state that is re-experienced during early infancy in the sense of wholeness that occurs, say, with early pleasurable feeds. As deintegration and reintegration continue, more stable internal structures and processes develop, leading to greater complexity as these in turn develop. For example, at the end of the first year, the baby begins to acquire what developmental psychologists term a theory of mind. It's just the very beginning of that. And that's when the baby begins to perceive that the mother has motives, intentions, and a mind of her own behind her face. And at that point, internal objects can take on a three-dimensional quality. I'll refer to this theory of mind a bit later. That's the model. I'm now going to look at 5 areas that struck me as where Fordham and Jung could be seen to differ. Certainly my impression from this study is that Fordham was very much a Jungian. I know by the time that I was training that he was associated, and sometimes critically so, with Jung. But
With Klein.
sorry, Klein. Thank you. But she doesn't really enter his writing until the 60s, and that's the time he becomes interested in the transference. The making of his model, which begins in 47, there are only very brief references to her, footnotes, and they are just sort of asides. It's not until he starts talking about the dynamics, early dynamics, that he begins drawing upon her. It's not to say he didn't value her. His early technique is really unrecognizable because he's very Kleinian, so he's having all these big archetypal erudite associations to this children's play, and it's completely out of touch with them if you read his 1944 book. He very quickly learns that he's very out of touch with children. He develops a way by using Klein's technique of play to get the data that creates his theory, but she doesn't contribute to his model. Now, one area that I think we're all aware is the way Fordham tried to clarify the definition of the self, and he did a study of Jung's use of the word self and came up with these two usages, totality and the self as archetype. He considered them incompatible definitions and spent quite a, I think, elaborate process in his study explaining that. For Fordham, the self referred to totality, of which the ego and from which the ego and the archetypes emerged. And I think one way of saying this that I've said before is that it's as if Jung had looked at his experiences and others of, say, a mandala in one way, and Fordham saw them in a developmental way. I'm not saying this very well. What I'm going to do is give a brief infant observation that tries to describe how Fordham views the self as a totality and the kind of data that he's working with. This is a baby I'm going to call Jake. He and his mother had been referred for parent-infant therapy, and I saw them when Jake was just over a month old. Throughout the session, Jake was asleep while his mother and I were talking. From time to time, I noticed Jake and what he was doing while he was asleep, which gave me the impression of a progression or unfolding of development in relation to what was going on around him. Just as I was entering the room to join Jake and his mother, the door slammed behind me with a loud bang. And Jake was in his slingcot placed on the floor just in front of his mother, and he startled at the noise, and his whole body jerking forward reflexively as if to curl protectively into itself, just jerked forward like that, but he didn't wake up. A bit later, I noticed Jake begin to squirm and slowly buckle forward, kind of modification of the earlier reflexive movement, after which he stretched out with his arms raised in front of him, like that, pretty much. He went quiet again and then wriggled a bit, his face puckering as if to work up into a cry, his head gently turning from side to side as if indicating no. He then stretched his arms forward and upward, his fingers extended with palms outward, so it appeared as if he was pushing something away, what I presumed the badness of the noise. A bit later, the pushing away movement was clearly directed towards me, what I guessed was the badness of my felt presence, which might have been linked with the bang. Speaking of bad presences. Sorry, April. That was very timely. Tell your caller that was very timely. So
Could you just repeat that?
Yes. First of all, he begins with this buckle, and then he starts to stretch. The stretch turns into a pushing away, and then the pushing away is clearly directed towards me, but I'm talking, so he's heard my voice. Could be that it's linked with the bad sound. Could be it's just an unfamiliar voice. Now, still later, I observed him making similar yet quite different motions towards his mother. He stretched his arm out toward her, but with his fingers extended and palms held downward. So it looked as if he was reaching, not pushing away. As I watched, his gestures seemed quite different. He reached out, and it seemed quite different depending on the direction of his arms. Towards me, he pushed away, and toward his mother, he reached. Now here we see a baby relating to what is happening around him in spite of being asleep. It's difficult to say what level of awareness he has, but he's certainly not conscious in the sense we ordinarily mean it. In fact, the distinction between conscious and unconscious is irrelevant, and it seems very useful to consider what is happening in terms of the self. Jake's self is a psychosomatic self, whereby bodily actions convey that experiences are being internally organized or differentiated into me and not me, and good and bad. It's, however, not an observation of the primary self, only of its expressions via deintegration and reintegration, functioning in a unified way within a separate unit, in quotes, responding to what's going on externally. These experiences are primarily probably in terms of sensations and not images proper. Although I'm trying to show how Fordham saw the unity and personhood of the infant, might this observation also be seen in terms of the self regarded as an archetype? And I'll come back to this. The next comparison I would like to make, or contrast, is the mind-body relationship with both Jung and Fordham. Fordham noted that Jung seemed divided on the issue of mind and body. Fordham writes, Jung conceived the archetype as the psychic representation of instinct only, but he often writes as if they were purely psychic forms. Also, Jung considered them as opposites. And this is from Jung, mind and body are presumably a pair of opposites, and as such, the expression of a single entity whose essential nature is not knowable either from its outward material manifestation or from inner direct perception. In psychological types, Jung defines self as the psychic totality. And I quote from him, "The self is the subject of my total psyche," it's my emphasis, my total psyche, which also includes the unconscious. Fordham, on the other hand, regarded the self consistently, after his model had been formed, as a psychosomatic entity, which, starting with the primary self, develops via deintegration and reintegration into mental and physical functioning. He resolves the mind-body paradox by taking a developmental perspective. And I quote from Fordham, "In treating these twin concepts, psyche and soma, as deintegrates, their origins in the self is not lost sight of, nor is their adaptive value left out of the account." Now, Jung was aware of the mind-body relationship in his experimental studies because they were based upon a mind-body relationship. And he wrote that he regarded affect on the one hand as a psychic feeling state and on the other as a physiologic innervation state, each of which has a cumulative reciprocal effect on the other. In other words, mind and body are separate but interrelate. Now, related to this is his distinction between emotions and feelings. And I think it's a very interesting distinction. It's one that the neurologist Anthony Damasio makes. And he describes an emotion which I've referred to before as a physical thing. This is Damasio. In a typical emotion, that certain regions of the brain, which are part of a largely preset neural system related to emotions, sends commands to other regions of the brain and to most everywhere in the body proper. The result of these coordinated chemical and neural commands is a global change in the state of the organism. The organs which receive the commands change as a result of the command, and the muscles, whether the smooth muscles in a blood vessel or the striated muscles in the face, move as they are told to do so. But the brain is changed just as remarkably. Now, in contrast to emotion is feeling, the same distinction Jung has made. A feeling requires secondary mapping or imaging out of the primary mapping of emotion. So the primary mapping of emotion includes physical, bodily constituents, and imaging is more properly psychic. Although they don't know how it's formed, it is, I suppose our work can be thought in terms of changing emotion into feeling, which is something that is much more processed and not so of the body and difficult to contain. Having made this distinction, recent neurological studies indicate that if we are to consider the self as a psychic totality, then emotions would need to be excluded. And although the self as a psychic totality may be the sense of what it is from clinical work with adults, can there really be a notion of the self that leaves out the body? If so, then what does one term the mind-body unity? Another area of contrast that I've noted is in Fordham and Jung's what they consider to be the ultimate. Jung's ultimate was described in Memories, Dreams, Reflections when he wrote, "Only gradually did I discover what the mandala really is." Excuse me. Formations, transformations, eternal minds, eternal recreation. In them I saw the self, that is my whole being, actively at work. In them I had attained what was for me the ultimate. Now, in contrast, Fordham had said at the conclusion of the first chapter of Explorations, "I conclude with a reflection on, quote, the ultimate. I take it to represent a state in which there is no past and no future. It has no desires, no memory, no thoughts, no images, but out of it by transformation, all of these can deintegrate. There is no consciousness, so no unconsciousness. It is a pregnant absence." Now, both ultimates seem to refer to mystic states or something like a mystical state. Fordham studied mysticism. Obviously, Jung spent a great deal more time studying mysticism, but Fordham too carried out a study into mysticism on St. John of the Cross, as looked into the works that his works and texts and poetry. In the chapter on St. John of the Cross in Explorations, Fordham aimed to trace the ultimate union with God that St. John had described to its sources in infancy, and he explained that his rationale for this, and I think it's important, is that and I quote from him, "The past never disappears, it's transformed." And he describes how he thinks that the mystical state becomes understandable as a transformed state reflecting an early state in infancy, this one involving an identification or state of identity with the good breast. And Fordham states that that state is nearest to the whole self, in the same way that the transformations that occur through, that St. John is describing, occur in a similar state. Now, does Fordham's state refer to the same object relationship, the same early, very primitive object relationship? And if he does, why did he add it? I don't know, but it strikes me that they are talking about different things. My view is that the pregnant absence description that Fordham gives is a pre-object state, the essence of which is potential. That is, it is a state that refers even more closely to the primary self. So while for Jung the ultimate is the individuated self, a unity that for him transcends the multiplicity of object relationships, for Fordham the ultimate is the primary self, which precedes but contains the potential and predisposition to develop into a multiplicity of objects and relationships with them. How are you faring? Do you want to come up for air? I'll have a swallow here. Now, the next point of contrast is in the origin of the archetypes. Jung had stressed that the archetypes were a priori, as was the archaic substrate of the collective unconscious. As Rosemary Gordon states, the archetypes, so Jung makes clear, are devoid of content to begin with until personal experience renders them visible and hence potentially conscious. Barbara Horton has described a metaphor that maybe is in Jung. I'd be interested to know where it comes from, but she has described it as being like a dry riverbed, that when they become filled with water, it begins to flow. It's a kind of life flow. In contrast, Fordham states that archetypes, which he uses synonymously with archetypal forms, have their origins in the primary self. He writes, in infancy, the archetypal forms are derived from the self through its deintegration. And elsewhere he puts that he equates deintegrates with archetypal forms, indicating that they're a product of development. Now, to clarify this distinction, I should like to refer to an observation in a video produced by Johnson & Johnson that I think some of you have seen. It's of baby Andrew, 40 minutes after his birth. And Andrew's been dried, but not washed or given various treatments, so that the smells and tastes of amniotic fluid are still with him on his fingers. He's been placed on his mother's abdomen, and slowly he starts climbing towards his mother's breast and face. The narrator relates that as he does so, the movement of his feet against her abdomen stimulates her uterus to clamp down, is the term, so that the bleeding stops, while also producing the love hormone oxytocin, resulting in powerful feelings of just utter besottedness. Then it's noted how Andrew looks from her face to her right nipple and back to her face again, and in the middle there are little pauses or rests when he sucks his fingers. The voiceover describes how there are similarities between the smell and taste of the amniotic fluid on his fingers and what he will smell and taste of his mother's milk. He continues to look from face to nipple and back again, and then lifting his head as he reaches her breast to look at his mother's face, he's put just in the right position to latch on to the areole, which he does. His mouth is dropped like that, and she opens her mouth as well. What seems is what she's doing. Now, this is a breathtaking interplay of nature and nurture, and appears to be a good example of innate archetypal phenomena. However, as Bremner, who is a psychologist, points out, this may be viewed as archetypal or pre-wired if we take birth as a starting point, but the fetus's activities in the womb may have been involved in the wiring up process. For instance, the stepping movements that Andrew uses to crawl up the mother's front are now known to be fetal movements, which are considered to be perhaps important in preventing the organism from becoming attached to the side of the uterus, sort of glued in. Furthermore, early visual preference is for contrasts and contours, which fetuses experience amodally through touch and sound. Therefore, when considering the origin of the archetypes, it's important to consider deintegration and reintegration before birth. As Bremner puts it, So instead of there being just one dramatic reorganization after birth, it seems more plausible that, starting in the fetal stage, there are a series of discontinuities brought about as higher regions of the brain become functional. So, where do we get to the collective in childhood if they are not, if they are derived from the primary self? Fordham held that archetypal phenomena in infancy was best understood early on as a body mythology, such as that Melanie Klein described, and that in terms of the development of the spiritual end covering the archetypal spectrum, the child's predisposition to develop archaic ideas, feelings, and fantasies are influenced and refined by education, which in turn, as in feedback systems, provides suitable imagery through which the unconscious archetypes can find expression in consciousness. These images that make up the collective become available via the culture at large, such as children's books, television, films, and the therapist's curse, video games. Miranda Davies has referred to the one-sidedness of many of these popular images and the imbalance of power, speed, and violence at the expense of smallness, dependency, and loss. I'm now coming to this last section of contrasting Fordham and Jung, but it's a bit more inclusive than that. It's about this primary self, the self, and the sense of self. Asking the question, what's the difference between the primary self and the self? Rosemary Gordon noted that the primary self is a, quote, a primitive form of the self. And above I've stated that Fordham used the term in a way that implied a period of development. Considering it as a period of development, one can ask, when does it begin and when is the self no longer primary? Fordham wouldn't be pinned down in dating its beginning other than to say that it occurred before birth, although he did play with possible answers. It's important to keep in mind that Fordham had postulated a psychosomatic integrate. Richard Carvalho warns against the, I quote from him, excuse me, the danger particularly when the idea of the self is pushed back prior to the formation of a nervous system and its function of apperception, because the idea invites theologizing, idealization, and inflation. Using part of his statement that it's the formation of a nervous system, one might consider the primary self to begin as early as around 7 weeks, when early stimuli to around the nose and mouth area will produce a response. In fact, that, according to one source that I've read, Bremner, that's the point at which the embryo becomes a fetus, when they begin to respond to the environment, but not, there's a point before. However, if one includes apperception, which generally means the cognition of a perception, then this dating may change. On the one hand, Bremner considers that in practice it's hard to draw a clear line between perceptual and cognitive processes. And on the other, someone named Eliot says that only in the second 6 months of life can the baby genuinely be said to have feelings. In other words, before that, they tend to happen to him. It's different than having a feeling. When we talk about the infant having a feeling, or the feeling having him, we're getting close to the controversy about self and sense of self. And within the SAP, Louis Zinken was Fordham's primary opponent in the discussion about this, in the discussion about the self and the sense of self. Zinken had written a paper in the journal, and in the paper he wrote, because Fordham is deeply concerned with babies and how they come to have a sense of self, a sense of an outside and inside, he posits an original self which seems quite undifferentiated, which he sees as deintegrating through an act of spontaneous division. It is here I have the greatest difficulty with this theory. The baby is at no time undifferentiated, even when it is a fetus consisting of only one cell. Louis would have known that a fetus isn't only one cell, but apart from that. As a model or a hypothesis of what takes place in infancy, I cannot accept there is an original self. I can agree with it only as a postulate like initial conditions in systems theory language, but would regard such a state as preceding the birth of the individual. James Astor had written back in a letter to the journal saying, "The Winnicottian idea that the original self is undifferentiated is not one that Michael Fordham subscribes to. I think that there are other flaws in confusions that I have in understanding how Zinken's understanding of Fordham's model, but I won't detail them here." The article produced eventually a response from Fordham, who in a exchange of personal letters wrote to Zinken, "You," meaning Zinken, "cannot conceive of a self without a sense of I or myself, but Jung persistently denies that his self is that, and he regularly distinguishes the ego from the self. I was quite horrified with a symposium on the self in the journal, to see how far our members had departed from Jung in this respect." So clearly that was one line of difference that may be raised again this evening. Fordham and Zinken's correspondence did bring them closer on certain points, and I thought raised other points of relevance here, including evidence that Fordham may not have been aware that he used the primary self as both a concept and a period of development. In one of his letters to Zinken, he indicated that he had been reluctant to date the onset of the primary self, but he encloses some notes that he had made about fetal development and deintegration, as if he's trying to come close to it. So that he says, after 5 months, when the brain has been fully formed, it's hard not to see how there might be a primary self. And even before this, it would be daring to assert that there are no physical elements from which mental life will emerge. And Zinken responds that when you avoid dating the original self, it is not simply that we don't know the date and one day might find it, but it has no date. In this sense, I take entirely your point that it is an abstraction. Fordham answers that it's not important to date it. He writes back, "I am struck and attracted to your idea that it has no date. This seems the obvious conclusion now that you've suggested it. If that is so, and I'm persuaded it is, then can we speak of it as existing? Against that we put Jung's idea, and that of others, which covers cosmic experiences extending to the limits of time and space. That's what I'm talking about." I think that it's not entirely clear what this statement means. I think there may be different interpretations of it. I certainly think that it's an example of one of Fordham's elliptical responses, which are not untypical. I believe that it referred to this study in the first chapter of Explorations into the Self, where he looks into Jung's experiences of the self, which he examines quite closely, where he is making really quite both a complex but important critique of Jung's use of the self that isn't often taken up. But here, my point is that Fordham seems to be thinking of a primary self as a concept beyond time and space and existence, which makes, while at the same time he's enclosing correspondence about dating the beginnings as if it did have an existence. This may be part of the principle of complementarity that I first referred to, but it can also be asked whether this is a contradiction or a paradox. I'm going to try and summarize this. I think that he tried to resolve this in this paper studying Jung's use of the self, in which Fordham says there's a primary self that deintegrates and reintegrates, and what comes out of this is an archetype that has special relevance. He refers to it synonymously and confusingly as the central archetype of order, the central archetype, and the archetype of order. But they all seem to be synonymous. They all have a particular relationship to the formation of the ego and a relationship to the ego, and also to the organizing of the other archetypes. So it's like a very early archetype, which means it is very tightly connected to the self, or intimately connected to the self. So he resolves it by saying there's a primary self that will produce this special archetype. Now, I had to read a lot into it. Perhaps I had to unlearn what I felt I had known about Fordham's model, because I don't know that Fordham ever discussed it. I think it appears in all three versions of this paper on the study of Fordham's use of the self. But that covers a period of over 20 years, and within that it's not developed. I don't know, Barry, whether he discussed that with you. And I didn't think to take it up with him when he was alive, what he meant by it. But certainly I think that it could work, and I think that trying to find the place in my paper where I can understand how this might correspond to my understanding of development. By the end of the first year, most infant researchers agree there is a surge of development involving the creation and establishment of more distinctly mental and psychic properties. This correlates with Stern's domain of subjectivity, or the development of the sense of self, and might be seen as the point, well, there's no point, but as a kind of shift from what Edelman calls primary consciousness, which is shared by most mammals who have asleep states and awake states, to secondary consciousness, which is reserved only for higher animal or higher order animals that have a basic awareness of their own subjectivity, and those mammals of us that can be self-reflective. An example of this is towards the end of the first year, an infant spontaneously seems to gather that a movement, like pointing, can be a gesture that has meaning expressing intent. That is, when the mother points, she intends to show the baby something over there. Before this point, the baby hasn't got a clue. After this point, the mother can point to something, or put that there, and the baby knows what to do. There's a vast array of changes at the end of the first year that include attachment behavior proper, and what Shore describes the development of the frontal cortex, the part of the brain that is considered to be that which makes us human. All point to the onset of capacities that will develop into self-awareness, self-reflection, and the sense of the self as a unified individual person with a mind of his or her own, something clearly more psychic. The difference between this archetype, it is a part of the whole, and its function is primarily integrative. The difference between that and the self, or the primary self, is that the primary self integrates and deintegrates, and it represents a totality. Just to say briefly that when asking when the primary self is no longer primary, I think that when it's a period where deintegrates predominate, and there is a lack of consolidated structures like the ego. I don't know that it doesn't happen at any one point, but when that begins to happen in terms of internal objects, or archetypal forms, archetypal structures, and the ego, then I think that it's probably more, and you don't need to think about the primary self as being primary anymore, but I couldn't date that. Anyway,
Good, thank you very much, Elizabeth. So, Warren, with more discussion if you'd like to
Yes,
respond.
well, Elizabeth's given a very rich and full paper, and I'm sure the mercury is squidging all over the place at the moment. So I shall try to be brief and to mix my metaphors, not to muddy the waters further. So I'm just going to try and do is to sort of headline several of the issues that Elizabeth has raised and just sort of indicate my take on them. The first one, taking up this notion about primary self, totality and archetype, which I've struggled with a lot and have always felt uncomfortable with. The conclusion that I've come to about this is that this is to do with the distinction between looking at the self from the point of view of theory and looking at it from the point of view of experience. I think this is another example of this complementarity that Elizabeth was talking about. It's important to understand that Fordham's theory was a theory, and he says, in distinguishing himself from Jung in this paper, it's doubtful whether Jung ever developed a theory of the self. And I think in saying this, Jung was indicating that he was coming at the idea of the self from a third person, outside observational perspective, which leads to a theoretical, abstract idea of a totality, which is by definition experienceable. And his view of the self is derived from and used to explain observed data, like the observation of Jake that Elizabeth described. Whereas Jung, of course, is consistently interested in and derives his concept from experience. And Fordham also makes this point, but much more strongly in the 1985 version of his paper than in the original 1963 version. So I think the distinction that Fordham makes between totality and archetype actually only has meaning at the theoretical level, and it seems to me that symbols represent the totality much more than Fordham allows. The second point I want to make is about the origin of archetypes. Just to say that if deintegration leads to the development of archetypal forms, it seems to me that these archetypal forms must somehow be inherent in the process of deintegration. How does the self know, inverted commas, how to organise its deintegrative processes, and why does it do so in archetypal ways, assuming that it does? This suggests that the archetypes as potential are there from the start, not as forms, much less as images, but implicit ordering principles. I've come to think, therefore, of the self as a kind of archetypal process that gives rise to archetypal forms and structures, which eventually, with the development of experience, emerge as archetypal images. And in this formulation, the self would not, as Fordham says, would not be regarded as an archetype. There would be a distinction. But rather than distinct, I don't like the idea that you have a totality self and an archetype self, as if they're two separate things. So I think you've got to find some way of acknowledging that this problem about the archetype as a part and the self as a whole that Fordham raises. And what I propose is to suggest that the self is not an archetype like other archetypes, not even a central archetype. I've come to think of it more as the archetype of archetypes. And that's why there's a kind of self-like quality, potentially, in all archetypes, which Fordham described in terms of, when he says, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like a deintegrate is endowed with and has the qualities of the self. The third point I should brush over, I think, really, which is to do with the mind and body issue. I actually think that Jung had a more of a sense of the self as a psychosomatic thing, although not a thing. And I think Fordham actually follows Jung in that respect. But again, the difference is that One is that Fordham is using a third-person perspective, and Jung is more interested in a first-person subjective view. But perhaps more importantly, that for Jung, I don't think mind is equivalent to psyche. Jung has a sort of panpsychic view at times, where he emphasises that psyche is the only direct reality available to us. And he seems to consider the idea of psyche itself as being that within which mind and body are united, because somehow for Jung the mind-body unity exists. The mind-body unity itself exists in the psyche because everything exists in the psyche. So I would suggest that when he refers to the single entity, which presumes mind and body to be a pair of opposites, what he's actually referring to is the self. The single entity of which mind and body are a pair of opposites is the self. And of course all opposites are united in the self, in Jung's idea. Now I just want to say something about this debate between Fordham and Zinkin, which is also extremely interesting, because I think in this debate you can see quite clearly the difference between a theoretical view of the self and an experiential view. Zinkin is at the hard end of the experiential view. I think Zinkin is often misunderstood because everybody says, "Oh, you're talking about the sense of self," and you can sort of almost hear Louis sort of rather wearily sort of arguing back about this and saying, it's of course Louis Zinkin understood the difference between the self and the sense of self. The point was for him that he felt that it was whatever it was that existed before there was a self, before there was a sense of self, couldn't be called the self. It was almost a sort of a semantic thing. He couldn't understand how and why the term self should be used to refer to something that could not be experienced. And in that sense, Louis Zinkin is also staying close to Jung, but a different aspect of Jung, the emphasis on subjective experience, and he takes that to its extreme, really. And I would say that the problem I find with Louis' argument is that I would agree that you can only have, experientially, you can only be aware of having a self once it's possible to have a sense of self, and that develops only in the course of interaction and development. But Jung also says that the self has always been there, and I think that's rather like, it's like, one day I discovered that all this beautiful music I've been listening to was by a chap called Mozart. But does that mean that Mozart wasn't there until I had the capacity to understand that music is written by somebody? The final point I'd make really is to emphasise that the self is not an entity, because anything that exists is defined by what it's not, whereas the self refers to a totality beyond all opposites, and that's why the self can only be described in paradoxical terms, as that which is and that which is not. And I think it was this recognition that led Fordham to add a final paragraph on the ultimate to the 1985 version of the self in Jung's works, that he became much more aware of the mystical nature of the self. But I think that I suspect that he did so through his theoretical study, so that even in coming to the ultimate, he came at it from a theoretical, intellectual, perhaps thinking function, whereas Jung came at it much more through an experiential, intuitive function.
Good, thank you, Warren.